So the Philly Tree Plan, I am going to be telling you a little bit about the plan just now, and then a bit about our current tree canopy in the city and how it's distributed, and some of the pre-plan engagement we did. And then Ari will talk through how we prioritized our outreach for the plan and the tools we use to get input. And then Mike will discuss how we can all work together to get these tools out to communities. So the Philly Tree Plan is a 10-year plan. It's a strategic plan for the equitable planting and care of our urban forest, and we have three main values that have guided our work throughout: community engagement, sustainability, and environmental justice. And equity and environmental justice have been a focus of our mission throughout, because we know that a huge part of creating this plan is listening to people. We know as urban forestry practitioners that trees can be both a source of joy and a source of stress for residents of cities. And so the goal of the plan is to bring the benefits of trees to the communities that need them the most in the ways that support them the best. So in terms of pre-plan work, in 2019, we did a tree canopy assessment with the University of Vermont Spatial Analysis Lab and the Forest Service. We found that we have 20% tree canopy in the city. You can see from the map, it is not equitably distributed. It is focused around some of our larger watershed parks and some of our richer neighborhoods. And then next slide. We also did an analysis of where we've lost and gained trees in the last 10 years. And this is a map of where we've lost trees. We lost 6% of our tree canopy in the last 10 years. And you can see from the map, it is also not distributed equitably across the city. And it is focused in areas that have larger yards. So residential land was one of the land uses that lost the most tree canopy. So before we even launched the actual planning process, we did a lot of stakeholder outreach to get input before we even chose a consultant. So we did a tree summit in December of 2019 to release the results of that tree canopy assessment to 100 people from organizations across the city, state and federal agencies, and community stakeholders, where we discussed the results of that canopy assessment, and we presented a draft scope of work for the strategic plan that we wanted to embark on to get feedback. And then we adjusted the scope of work based on that. We released our RFP with a pretty varied scope of work that involved mapping, management recommendations, policy programs, and more. So we have we prioritized large teams, and we chose our consultant team, which Ari is the lead consultant on, and we have a large, I think 7 or 8 consultants on our team to tackle this huge scope of work. And we began work in October of 2020. Ari, this is you now.
Great, yeah, that was having that really well-defined RFP was really critical in setting up the project. And one of the things that drew us to responding to it, the fact that it was very much a community engagement led and a community design led project. So one of the first things that we did was to look at, it's a big city, and trying to figure out how do we get a handle on the places that may need trees the most. We started from a standpoint knowing that the urban forest was not equitably distributed, and so we wanted to get a better understanding of the impacts of that inequity. And so the project team, which is really like the client team, the incredible group of people that were part of the client team, that included a number of associated organizations and experts. They pulled together a really wonderful community voices group that was of 30 different individuals that from all over the city. And they were, tree champions, I would call them, of all walks of tree champion. And they were speaking for their neighborhoods, and they helped us figure out what the factors were that we should be overlaying. I would call it an environmental justice map, except for it doesn't cover some of the other parts of environmental justice. It's really focused on what are the things that trees impact, what are the ways that trees can impact people's lives. We looked at health determinants, so air quality, as well as getting information from our health department about what types of what rates were people experiencing asthma or COPD, and obviously heat as well. So looking at heat vulnerability, not just land surface heat temperature data, but heat vulnerability data that is really good data from our health department, and as well as looking at where we have higher rates of poverty. And part of that is because we know that the work of growing the urban forest is not just putting the trees in the ground, it's also bringing economic opportunity. And so we overlaid all of those factors to develop this priority map that you see here on the right. And so sort of the more orange it is, the higher priority it is, the more impact we believe trees will have. And we ground truth that with our 30-member community voices group. That community, so you can see that community voices committee here. These are all the tools that we used. They're not all equal tools, and they all got different types of results. We believe that you have to do a lot of different types of engagement to capture all the different types of stories, and to give residents many different ways of engaging, and so they can find the one that is most comfortable for them, and where they feel like they can contribute the most. So we had that community voices committee that met throughout the project to check in. They developed the logos, the color palettes, even for this project. They were really deep into deciding everything about the way that this plan was put together. We had a citywide survey, which was a pretty long survey, and we ended up getting about 8,000 responses in total. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We did a community meeting tour, which was that was taken on by the Erica's team. We're going to existing community meetings and talking to people at those meetings and telling them about what we were doing, and then getting their input. Over 30 meetings. We had a neighborhood ambassador group, which you can see here on the right, and I'll talk more about that. We had stakeholder workshops, which was kind of a continuation of that tree summit in some ways, to have focused conversations around people people that represented agencies and organizations that dealt with trees. And then we also created a virtual open house because of COVID. We couldn't meet in person for a lot of these, but we did try to have a forum where we could share the information about the background information that we were gathering, and then also our approach to the plan, to have that be an open forum online that we made as a Google Sites website. And then we also had an Instagram photo challenge. So if you didn't want to answer any questions on a survey, and this was also aimed at maybe some younger folks who would be interested in sharing the ways that they feel trees in their neighborhood. And that was the hashtag Philly Tree Stories. So I talked a little bit about the Community Voices Committee already. It was 30+ members from all over the city, and they really did steer everything. We checked everything through with them. They were paid a stipend to participate, and they were invaluable. They really helped us make sure that everything was really true to. They ground truth everything we were doing. The citywide survey, we developed it as it was an online survey. It had all kinds of questions that were qualitative and quantitative. We had ideas of different types of policy changes that we thought that we might be exploring, to trying to get general feedback on that, to see sort of what the temperature was on tree protection in particular, and mostly qualitative type stories. So qualitative type data. So we asked people about their relationships in many different ways, and we got thousands of stories, literally thousands of stories that we got to do something with it. We're not sure what they can't all fit in the plan, but maybe coffee table book coming. But so maybe that's an ask later. What do we do with all these stories? But that was really incredible. And as I was talking in a breakout group, one of the things that I think is one of the most valuable lessons we learned from that survey is that people love trees. And it's not a matter of people not understanding the value of trees. It's about overcoming the burden that trees can present. That sentiment was echoed again in these community meetings. You can see each of these dots is where a community meeting happened. All of these organizations. These were sort of organizations that held regular community meetings, and they were visited twice, once to kind of get an initial pulse, and then after we had some draft recommendations, they were checked in with again. And those were decided largely around those priority areas. The Neighborhood Ambassador Program, we developed cohorts in each of our 7 general priority areas. And so it was intended for those cohorts to be able to talk with each other and meet with ambassadors in other neighborhoods. This was some of the most valuable information that we collected. We were able to spend a lot more time with them. It was a 10-week program that had a very structured curriculum. They were also paid. It was not about educating them to tell their neighbors about the value of trees. It was more about helping them have a basis for understanding urban forestry, and then having them go interview their friends and their relatives about their relationship to trees. And we got a lot of really incredible information out of that and stories that have guided the plan. One of the things that I would say that was one of the most impactful things we got out of that is that we see the data showing that there is inequity in the urban forest. It's not equitably distributed. People feel it on the ground. They recognize that walking into, they can tell when they cross different neighborhood boundaries, and that the trees were also following racial boundaries, which was something that was felt very personally. They were tasked also with taking pictures, much like participating in that Instagram challenge and walking around their neighborhood and sharing, the ways that trees affect their lives. We had a really wonderful photographer collaborator who trained everybody on how to shoot with an iPhone or a smartphone. Tips and tricks for how to take great photos. And we got some really great photos, and that are all going to be they're going to be incorporated into the plan. So this is sort of the engagement by the numbers. So 7,000 survey responses in total. We also, one of the reasons that we had the priority areas was to check our survey responses and to check our responses in general. And to guide our engagement. And so we initially, this is not what this tree cookie chart looked like initially. We were having a hard time getting our numbers up in the priority areas, and we saw that happening. And then we put more effort into getting those numbers up. We had a community organizer partner who went out into those priority areas and distributed flyers. And we did some phone banking and texting, and we had yard signs as well with QR codes. And we were pretty proud of how we ended up getting those numbers up, so that it was 60% of our responses were in those priority areas, which was really great. We distributed the survey in 8 different languages. We had 22 ambassadors in 5 different neighborhoods, 62 peer interviews, and we had 847 residents participating in those 32 community meetings. And they were touched. These guys were engaged twice, 2 different meetings. So I guess that was my. We could talk about this obviously for a lot longer, but that was my blitz of what we did for the engagement, and I'm going to pass it off to Mike to talk about next steps.
In the Save a Tree Consulting Group, we work on tree canopy planning and urban forest management planning from coast to coast. And we hear from everybody, they're really interested in tree equity. they don't really know how to do it. So I was really impressed in working with the Hinge team and Erica and her team in both the quantity and quality of practices they brought to bear to get as much community input as possible. I'm sure there's things that we didn't think of. So part of the ask here is to say, what's a best practices playbook that we could share back and forth between each other to try to get better at it? And some potential questions to throw out to you. Can tree boards create equity barriers? A lot of tree boards are established by city code, and they're basically designed to give like free expertise to the city. Engagement isn't often how they're contextualized, but maybe a reframing of that could provide greater opportunity for community input. Can funders create equity barriers? There's been a big push in recent times for funders to have, outcome-based funding. So it's how many trees you can plant for how cheap. But when you're researching underserved populations, they may require unusual approaches because of language barriers, because of mistrust and suspicion of government. Sometimes people, if they're going to devote time to something, they need to be paid for it. And sometimes these kinds of approaches and activities aren't eligible grant activities in the funding source. The urban forest management plans meet the needs of underserved communities. Often it's more trees, better trees. As Ari said, sometimes the unanticipated expense of tree maintenance, control of spontaneous unwanted vegetation, damage to sidewalks, to water infrastructure, whether it's stormwater, wastewater, water supply, can all make a big deal to people. So contextualizing how these might affect people who don't have a lot of resources but still want trees and need them to be managed is something important. So thanks for the opportunity to share this with you, and we'll take the last few minutes for any comments and questions you have.
Yeah, you've packed a lot of really interesting information in a short amount of time. So folks, go ahead and pop questions into the chat, or if you want to come off mute and ask verbally, go ahead. I've got one I'm itching to ask, but I will defer to the gathered wisdom in the room.
This is Faith. Something at the bottom of the screen is covering up your last bullet point.
It's when I click anything on my Zoom, it brings up my bottom bar.
We have two questions in the chat. One is more information on the heat and health data, how you obtain that. And the second question is how many participants were in the cohorts of the neighborhood ambassadors?
So the heat and health data came from the Philadelphia Health Department primarily, and it was publicly sourced data. One of the reasons that we used those data sets is because they are updated by the health department, and we're setting goals around canopy impact, not just the number of trees planted and canopy cover. And so we wanted to make sure that that was a data set that could be revisited in a decade from now. And so that was the primary sources for that heat data. It's the heat data is land surface temperature plus other vulnerability indices. So it was that also rolled into it age, young, high proportions of young people and old people, and even access to cooling facilities, things like that. So it wasn't just raw heat data; it was a heat vulnerability index that was developed by the health department. The question about was how many were in each cohort? Was that the question? We were shooting for a minimum of 4, and one of those actually was a youth cohort. And so we actually teamed up with a counselor at a high school who actually helped us recruit those students and actually managed those students and received a stipend as a participant. But was her primary role was actually to organize those students for them to complete the tasks and to help them. We also had a community, our community organizer consultant had a which was Rising Suns here in Philadelphia, had a really wonderful support person there who those ambassadors could call or ask tech support questions, or she was just very hands-on to just be able to answer any questions and kind of shepherd them through the entire process. You know, it being during the pandemic, we also had some challenges with technology, and we actually distributed tablets to all of them with all of the presentations loaded, as well as, you know, any place that they needed to input data was already set up. They needed their own internet connection, which was sort of a hurdle that was, we didn't have anybody that had too much trouble with that, but we would have had to figure that out if somebody had low internet connection. But we tried to remove as many barriers to that as possible.
I'm going to jump in because I want you to have a chance to answer one more substantive question. There's some great questions about Instagram. We can also do some follow-up with the collaborators and share back to the community. But just as a final couple of words, you literally have 15 seconds or so. But was there any feedback you all received from community members that really altered your thinking around urban forest management writ large, or maybe really influenced an outcome or goal of the plan? Like big ways that all that community feedback changed your thinking. Quick thoughts.
I mean, I think that there are big ways that the data we collected confirms things that many people already know, but is not currently kind of the narrative in urban forestry. You know, we are adjusting our narratives to incorporate, like, how can we help people overcome the burdens that prevent them from participating in programs? And Laura is going to talk a lot about that in just a few minutes. But we really got a lot of data to support the different ways that trees are a burden, and that really supports us tackling things that are not pure tree canopy growth, because you can show so well how they are barriers to tree canopy growth, because urban forestry is about people, and you can't grow tree canopy in places where people don't want trees. So I think it was more that. I'll let Ari say if there's anything else that comes to mind for him.
Super fast. I think the big thing that changed that did shape a lot of the plan is that we didn't have to spend a lot of time educating people about the value of trees. That wasn't the primary challenge. And also that there are so many people who are already tree champions, and we just got to get out of their way and support them. And so a lot of our plan is actually focused on supporting people already doing that good work and removing the barriers for the work that they're already doing and listening to them. And that really did change the plan. We're not spending a whole, it's not like, we need this whole education program on teaching people about the value of trees. That is not where we should spend our money. We need to spend our money lifting up the folks that are already doing good work.